Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Pleasure to be with all of you.
Eric and Jody and I, we've kind of held off doing a deep dive topic on George Meade up until this point, really because we knew your book was going to be coming out, and we really thought, let's wait till we can get Kent Masterson Brown on to do what would really be hopefully an appropriate and perhaps even definitive deep dive in Meade at Gettysburg. So no pressure. But this is kind of our first big chance to really kind of address our audience on what we think George Meade did and get into during the Gettysburg campaign.
Sure.
So let me kind of start. I've listened to a lot of your interviews in other forums, and they often seem to ask, I think, by kind of addressing one of Gettysburg's oldest cliches, specifically, why hasn't Meade gotten the attention from historians that we would seem that he would deserve as the winner of the Battle of Gettysburg? And I kind of don't want to start with a cliche like that. So I kind of thought what I would open with an opening question would be, why do you think it took so long for someone to write a command study focused on Meade? When we've had numerous other command studies on Lee and Longstreet and other people, why did it take so long to focus on Meade? And then as a follow-up to that, why did you decide to write that book?
Let me answer that in reverse, if I might.
Mm-hmm.
I got interested in George Meade, researching and writing the book Retreat from Gettysburg. I had never given enormous thought to George Meade. I mean, in the sense that I wanted to write something before I tackled the Retreat from Gettysburg. And that was a long haul, finding the information for that book. And during the course of it, and particularly as I was writing it, I began to get a healthy respect for that man. I found here's a fellow who everyone, you talk to anybody on the street about George Meade, the first thing they say, oh yeah, he's the guy that didn't follow up Robert E. Lee. Everyone says it. Everybody says it.
Yeah.
And here I found a commander who had his own problems with his army being fed, being equipped, being shoed, his horses being fed. And yet, there he was on July 10, staring at Robert E. Lee along the Potomac River. And only the fact that Lee had developed a defense line that was so formidable that Meade didn't attack him. But he was in a position to do so. And I thought, well, that certainly shot the old idea that he didn't pursue him, because by God, he did. And then it became evident to me that many people eschewed up to that point in time, this up to now, writing about George Meade, because the storyline was so embedded in people and in prominent historians, mm-hmm. that I think it was one that they shunned walking into that swamp. And once that book was published, I said, I think I'm going to do something on George Meade. And I think we've got material here that no one's seen, that no one's thought about. And anyway, I'll tell you, I don't like what I've read in some of those large works. I just don't like what I read about him. And yeah. I said, it's time we take a crack at it. So that's really kind of in reverse, but answers both of them, I think.
Yeah, fair enough. And I think you kind of guessed what was going to be my follow-up question to that. You see people say a lot that there have never been any positive studies of Meade out there, that everything about Meade is negative. And I don't think that's true. A number of the Gettysburg campaign studies have had their positive aspects, all in varying degrees. Coddington, or as we say on the show, Coddington, Fans, Trudeau, Sears, Pennypacker.
Yes.
Those people have been generally favorable. And yet, in the other camp, we have Gelzo and Ryan and to some degree Hunt, that maybe have not been as favorable. So I was going to ask you as a follow-up, why do you think the guy who won the Battle of Gettysburg still divides historians like that?
Well, I don't know how much he is, at least as it stands right now, historians are divided for sure. I mean, there's always going to be the Gelzo camp. There's always going to be that. But I don't know. I'm just looking at social media, if nothing else.
Yeah.
There are an awful lot of people now who have really made adjustments about this.
Yeah.
And it's really kind of heartwarming to see that. It's hard to imagine a person who commands, operational commander of an army of 90,000+ troops, who defeats Robert E. Lee. The first defeat that army he commands first victory that army he commands has had in 26 months since the war began. And he does so in the largest land engagement ever fought on the North American continent. And yet, there are those who will detract. There are those who will criticize to the point where that's meaningless. He didn't follow up. He didn't pursue. He didn't attack. All this. And I just hope that we've started to turn the ship around.
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned social media in that regard, because I think you're right. I think to a lot of students of the battle and those who engage regularly on social media, I think to a lot of them, Meade has had a favorable impression for some time. And I often go back to even the early 1990s, where I feel like it started to turn over in the pages of Gettysburg magazine. And yet it's taken until now for that to really sort of permutate itself into major campaign studies. Like
you're right about Gettysburg magazine. You're right about Gettysburg magazine. It is one source where you find numerous positive articles about him, and some very interesting articles otherwise. But I mean, of course, the magazine gets to a limited audience of people who are real Gettysburg aficionados, or ones have just a real interest in Gettysburg. Getting it out there to the great world is the next task, of course. And this is where social media, and I'm not putting a whole lot of stock in social media. I'm just saying I see a whole lot of comments coming in that are really heartwarming. And they got the story that that I tried to tell. So.
Yeah, and likewise, some recent authors who have still been critical of Meade have at times had to answer in those same social media forums.
Yeah, they sure have. And by the way, Alan Gelzo's a friend of mine. I'm very fond of him personally, and we get along famously. We talk on the phone periodically, but I had to give it to him now. I mean, I just had to give it to him. That's all.
Well, very nice disclaimer that you threw in there, because we're going to come back to that later on a certain passage of the book where you mentioned me, for example. So we're going to come back to that.
Did I mention you?
Yes, I've heard about that once or twice. Yes.
But I said it was a very fine book.
I know. You said it was a fine book, and I was willing to let it lie there, but the scholars of social media kind of have some other thoughts that we might have to.
Wait, did you just say scholars of social media?
Yes, you heard that.
Is that an oxymoron? Or
no,
what?
You heard that correctly.
Okay. Just making sure
the irony alert of the podcast today. Okay, I'm going to pause for a minute before we kind of get into the book itself. Eric, Jody, I don't know, did you guys have any questions along this introductory line you wanted to?
Well, I was going to bring up that I thought this is the first time I ever saw Meade as a human. I know that sounds silly, but when you introduce the letters of Margaret and some of his thoughts, you don't see that in a lot of the other books.
No.
We always see Meade. Meade didn't do this. He's very this is the first time you meet him as a general and a human. I think that makes an impact. Maybe that's why social media is being nice to him.
It could be.
I mean, seriously.
Could be. No. I mean, and I tried to get as many glimpses of him from others looking at him as to what he looked like at various stages of the campaign and the battle. And I love the one that Captain Huntington writes about him on Cemetery Hill when John Newton arrives. And he describes the black bags under his eyes. Now, the man has had no sleep. I mean, and really for 2 days now. And the description is just incredible. But descriptions like that, and then you're right. I mean, his letters to Margaret are spectacular. They're just spectacular.
And I think, like in the past, we've seen a lot of that with Lee. People describe him and what he seemed like during the battle and before and after. And we've never seen that with Meade. So it's almost like we see him as just like a man, not just this person who didn't pursue Lee.
Yeah.
So I appreciated that.
Well, thank you. I don't know if one can chronicle another operational commander of an army, and I'm sure there are these, who was thrown so many curveballs, one after another, after another, after another. Yet he seems to he overcomes them all. He's a tough character, and the greatest, although I try to keep myself out of those things, I just tell you what crises he's facing, and then you go on. But to the reader, you can come away from that saying this is a guy who has an immense amount of character. Tough, decisive. He was described by his contemporaries as decisive, and boy, he is. And without me saying it, but just to read what the man does with each crisis that's thrown at him tells you volumes about what he is. Would you like him in your foxhole? You're darn right I would. And that's the mark of a great commander.
You know, it's interesting that we touched on this because one of the questions I kind of had queued up was the fact that, you know, this is not a cradle to grave biography of Meade. I mean, this is Meade at Gettysburg, a study in command. But as you were learning more about the man and more about the general, were there any specific highlights in his pre-Gettysburg career that you learned, that you came across, that you thought maybe served him particularly well as this new role of commanding general was kind of thrust upon him?
It's hard to say, really. I think probably the best way to answer that would be he, like so many of the corps commanders in the Army of the Potomac, faced one frustration after another, in one engagement, one campaign after another. Frustration with the Army being, frankly, either defeated and humiliated, which was the course that poor Army led all that time. And if anything, all of that has a tendency to steel one against all kinds of adversity. I mean, we've faced all this before. And he's in the middle of all that as a corps commander. And I would imagine the combined frustration, the defeat, all that brings to an Army commander of his stature, corps commander, had a tendency to with lack of a better word, to steel him against all kinds of adversity. And he really faced it in the Gettysburg campaign, unlike anything I've ever seen.
Yeah, absolutely.
Literally from the moment he takes command. The moment he takes command, the Jeb Stuart's 3 brigades strike 2 bridges on the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, cut all the telegraph wires, and then hit that wagon train coming out of Baltimore. I mean, he hadn't even, the ink isn't dry on his daggone acceptance note, and he's already facing a huge issue. He can't communicate with his capital.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how it starts. And none of this is Meade's doing. It's he has to just deal with them. And wow. I don't know if I know of any who's faced quite so much in one short campaign.
It's interesting you make that point. Often on tours, when I set up Meade taking command, I'll often say, in my opinion, I don't think any general in American history has been handed a tougher assignment.
No, you're right.
George Meade was handed.
You're right.
In the time given. I mean, it's one thing, talked about Eisenhower a little earlier off air. He had months to prepare for the invasion of Europe.
Oh, he sure did.
Meade has hours.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's fascinating to see all the adversity that the Army of the Potomac faces. And usually that adversity caused them to crumble somehow.
You're right. You're right. You're right.
Very interesting, because you would think an organization that has disappointment and defeat after disappointment and defeat, that you wonder how many of those can they withstand. And for whatever reason, Meade is able to put them in a position to win and actually win, which I think is remarkable.
And you can almost sense with each setback that he faces, each crisis, it's like he says to himself, we are not going to let this happen to this army again. And that's what I mean by steeling yourself. It is not going to happen on my watch. And when you read his letters to Margaret and others about what's happening in that poor army up to the time he's named commander, and while he's commander, I mean, you can see how this has really made an impact upon him, such that, by God, it's not going to happen on my watch.
Yeah, and this is a great point, and it kind of segues into one comment that I've heard from friends and colleagues who have read the book. One positive feedback was a number of folks have mentioned that when Meade takes command on June 28th and has that transitional meeting with Hooker and staff that morning, a number of folks have felt like your book in particular does a good job of kind of bringing more detail to that meeting than maybe we have seen in the past. So maybe for the listener here, do you want to kind of just set the stage? We're in Frederick, Maryland, morning of June 28th, 1863. Somebody comes into General Meade's tent and gives him some good news. You want to maybe just kind of pick up the story from there?
Yeah, he is notified around 3:30 in the morning from a emissary from Edwin Stanton's office that I've got news for you. It may have even said, I've got bad news for you. But Meade believes at the time he's either under arrest or something like that. And at least that's what he writes to his wife. And he's told he's been named commander of the Army of the Potomac. And he's at his headquarters tent of the 5th Corps along Barringer Creek outside of Frederick. And he gets on his horse, puts on his, I suppose he's been sleeping in his trousers. I mean, the poor fella puts on his coat and tries to look as decent as he can and rides over to the Prospect Hall where Hooker's headquarters are located just south of the town of Frederick. And there, they make the announcement to Hooker that he's been relieved. In fact, Hooker had asked to be relieved. This still, though, was a very tense moment. And the concern in Washington was whether or not this would even be an orderly transfer of authority. That Meade wouldn't accept it. That's why they literally ordered him to take it. They didn't interview him before like they did all other commanders. They didn't ask before. They simply ordered him to take it. And you look at that picture now, that poor army, again, has not won an engagement in 26 months. And no one wants to be commander of the Army of the Potomac. And you think of, at this stage, by the way, you think of the Lincoln administration. It has an abysmal record right now in the East. It has some successes in the West, but that's not where the press is. The press is in the East. And in all those big cities of Baltimore, Philadelphia, Boston, New York, the people who volunteer to serve in the Army are going in the East. That's where they're going to be serving for the most part. And after all those defeats, there's not very much enthusiasm to serve in the Union Army. They can't get people to volunteer to join the Union armies. So in March, they institute a draft, which drafts are always unpopular and frankly should be unpopular, but they are always unpopular. And so here's the Lincoln administration, poised, frankly, for civil disturbance because of the draft. And he's got an army whose commander he has lost confidence in completely. And he can't find anybody to agree to take command of that army. To think of that situation, you can almost understand at the end of the Gettysburg campaign, how Lincoln wanted so much for Lee's army to be, quote, destroyed.
Right.
He saw no other way out of this. And when Lee is, of course, it's unrealistic to think that Lee's army could be destroyed. Nevertheless, Lincoln reacted strongly to the fact that he was not. And, there's the genesis of all the trouble for George Meade. And it's human. I mean, I don't fault Lincoln in the sense that he was just a bad actor. It's think of what was in the balance in this for him. And so anyway, he is ordered to take command of the army. And it winds up being a rather orderly process once Hooker is notified and Meade agrees and sends his message back to the War Department accepting it. And from there, Meade and Hooker retire to look at maps and to discuss dispatches. Meade wants to know where the army is, where all its 7 corps are, where are its cavalry commands, and where, for heaven's sakes, is the enemy. And a difficult thing to discern in 1863. He has reports from the New York Times and Philadelphia Inquirer and all these other newspapers telling stories about where Confederate forces are in Pennsylvania, some in Maryland. But some of these are 24, 48 hours old. So where are they when Meade wants to know now on the 28th of June? Well, who knows? Probably the most interesting dispatches Meade reads are communications from civilians who are
right.
Coming over the Turner Pass in buggies and wagons and coaches and reporting things to federal officers about what they've seen. And some of those recordings are absolutely remarkable. But they were telling George Meade that you've got Lee's entire armies across the Potomac. It's spread out in Maryland into Pennsylvania, Chambersburg. Some are as high as north as Carlisle, some as far east as York. And Meade's now got to determine, what do I do with this army now? Not an easy task. And the trouble is the Catoctin Mountains and the South Mountain Range are going to screen all of Lee's operations west of George Meade, and he'll have no knowledge of them unless somebody, mostly mounted commands, are able to report to him. And when they do report, again, they're 12, 20 hours old. And so Meade determines, looking at the maps, I put this in the book, that he looks at the maps. And by the way, all he has are residential maps. I even found, by the way, a commentary from inside the War Department, is quoted in the book, where the War Department had made topographical maps of that entire region, but never printed them.
Government at work.
Does that sound like government work? Never printed those things. So he's using residential maps of Frederick and Carroll counties and Adams County, Pennsylvania. But when he looked at those maps, he sees that Lee's army from Chambersburg to Cashtown to Gettysburg to York obviously are using the famed Chambersburg Pike, Chambersburg to York Pike. And that if they're not on that pike, they're just north of it. Some have been as far as Carlisle, but most of them are just north of that pike. And I refer to that pike as kind of the turnpike axis, where all of Lee's operations are being directed. And Meade literally determines, looking at that, to move as close to that axis as he can get, and still be in a position to protect Baltimore and Washington, which was the one order Halleck gave him.
Right.
That on the 28th of June is that you protect Baltimore and Washington. But anything else you do is up to you.
Yeah.
You better make sure you protect that. Well,
yeah,
so
I was just going to say, I'm glad you mentioned that, because obviously that's an often quoted passage in Halleck's orders to Meade, that you are the covering army of Washington and that you need to keep Baltimore. And what I was wondering about from your end too, I know some historians and interpreters who think those instructions limit Meade's movements. And I know other historians and interpreters who kind of say, no, that helps give Meade very clearly defined instructions on what his objective is. And I'm curious which camp or neither camp do you fall in?
well, let's put it this way, those are restrictive to a point. And that is, you can maneuver. You can try to get yourself into a position to defeat the enemy, possibly offensively, and still do that, and still protect Baltimore and Washington. It's not easy, but that is a key to the entire campaign,
right?
Even to the pursuit of Lee after the fighting is over. Those orders, Halleck brings them up on the 5th of July to George Meade.
Yep.
So long as you protect Baltimore and Washington. So terrified, there might be raids, as he put it, from elements of Lee's army.
You know, I can understand the importance of Washington, but geez, if you want Baltimore, yeah, let them have Baltimore.
That's kind of the way I feel too.
Jody from Maryland, no rebuttal there.
But of course that's the railhead. That's the railhead.
Right.
At the time, it was very important.
I know.
I'm not talking about today, but in 1863, Baltimore was important.
In fact, I think I might, James, I might really reverse that. You can have Washington today. I mean, I need the whole thing.
There you go.
Throw it in it. I don't want to get into that. But
you know, Lee captures Baltimore. What does he get? Some Domino sugar, a bunch of Old Bay, and basically
he can figure out how to make the Orioles a winning team again. That can be Lee's problem.
He can sprinkle some of that Oriole magic out there.
Exactly.
Yeah, I'd say I argue Lee had absolutely no interest in going there. None.
Right.
But that didn't prevent those people in Washington from believing he did.
Right.
And that's the key.
I think it was more of a, if he gets there, he's going to be so close. I think it was more of a, he'd be too close to Washington. Kind of a fear factor in a way.
Yeah. But what's amazing is that Meade takes command on the 28th of June. By the night of the 29th, he has got that entire army situated, frankly, along Big Pipe Creek. I mean, in Carroll County, Maryland, just below the Pennsylvania border. I mean, the entire army. And some of these guys have been marching like 32 miles that day. I found it interesting getting into the supply problem. Meade constantly is telling his Rufus Ingalls to order these troops more shoes. That's what he's always done. We need more shoes. By the time dawn, July 1, Meade will have ordered 50,000 pair of shoes for that army. Did they ever arrive? No. Think of that.
Yeah.
That the Army of the Potomac, that he is marching these distances. If 50,000 covers all the shoeless soldiers in the Army of the Potomac, then half of the army is without shoes. And I'll guarantee you there are way more than that. Those are just the ones that he ordered for. So, but he gets that entire army in a position right below the Pennsylvania border, 7-8 miles from Gettysburg, where the Chambersburg Pike, the Turnpike axis is, to be in a position to do something with this enemy. It's remarkable.
You know, actually our first real episode we ever did was on June 28th, and we referred to it as a critical day. And I'm of the opinion, I think other than a July 1st, 2nd, or 3rd battle day, it's arguably one of the most important days of the Gettysburg campaign for what happens.
Oh, yeah.
And I think it's remarkable. You know, we talk about what Meade's orders were, and thinking back to that episode, I've always felt that Meade, it's probably refreshing to be told what's expected from Washington.
Mm-hmm.
How many times do we hear Army of the Potomac commanders, what exactly do they want from me? What do they want?
It's true.
We've told that. However you do it, we don't care, just as long as you cover the bases.
Right, right.
And I think that gives Meade a lot of latitude. And I think what's really remarkable, and I think your book does a good job of looking into this, is it struck me how you would think Meade would be overwhelmed. Anybody would be overwhelmed in the situation. And Meade just seems to have kind of this even keel personality. I think, I was really amazed. We often talk about Lee being kind of the quote unquote Christian warrior.
Mm-hmm.
Meade's very much the same way. I think
he's almost identical.
Putting it in my faith, and we'll see how this takes out.
That's exactly right. Leave it up into the hands of, quote, our Heavenly Father.
Right. I mean, if I would have used that quote, somebody would have said, "Oh, that was said by Robert E. Lee."
Yeah, exactly.
That sounds like a Lee quote. And
exactly.
And I think it's kind of interesting. I think it goes back to even what Jody said. You did a good job, I think, fleshing out Meade the person. He often comes to us as almost a one-dimensional. He's the goggled-eyed snapping turtle. But we don't really know much about him compared to other commanders. So we have all these kind of neat little human interest stories.
Yeah, well, you're part of that, and I wanted to ask Kent about this, so this might be a good segue. You know, obviously there's Cleave's biography, Meade of Gettysburg, but beyond that, for years and years and years, people have primarily relied on Life and Letters to try to get their glimpse of George Meade. Now, I know you have read the original letters that are at the Historical Society in Philadelphia, and in some cases, as often happens, Meade's correspondence was later sanitized by the family, for publication. So what is in the original letters is not always what shows up in Life and Letters. And because I read the original letters when I was doing research for my Sickles book, and I think part of what you see in the original letters is maybe a little more frustration at lack of promotion. Certainly, as you guys just touched on, maybe a little bit more of a faith in God type of thing that we often thought with George Meade. But one thing that comes out in the letters is his relationship with John Reynolds. Mm-hmm. And Kent, as we get into June 30th and then ultimately July 1st, perhaps up to this point, no aspect of your book has gotten more attention or discussion than the Meade-Reynolds relationship, and specifically how Reynolds is used on July 1st. So you want to start maybe with a little bit what you think of the Meade-Reynolds, and then go from there.
I'd be delighted. there is absolutely no doubt that John Reynolds and George Meade were very, very good friends, close friends. This is a relationship that grew over the years in the war, over the months in the war. Both of them starting out as brigadier generals in the Pennsylvania Reserves. And Meade grew to have a deep respect for John Reynolds, and I think it was also reciprocated. Now, were they rivals? Yes, they were rivals. They were serious rivals, and that's not unusual in the Army. Army officers are always rivals with one another. They rivals for rank, rivals for notice, because that's what helps one get elevated in the Army. So all that's perfectly natural that would happen. But they were very close, and so close that in my research, I've mentioned this numbers lots of times before, and I like to mention because I remember this happening to me. I was in the National Archives and going through the 11th Corps papers, and I found an envelope in the 11th Corps papers. And I have a photocopy that I made in the reading room, and the cover of that read, "Official papers found on the body of Major General John F. Reynolds, commanding Right Wing Army of the Potomac, July 1, 1863." And I started flipping through it, and half of these things were not found in the official records. Some of them were. But the most interesting letter of all was found in the official records. And it was a letter from George Meade to John Reynolds on the 30th of June, 1863. And in this letter, I'm trying to find that mic. I have a photocopy of it that I wanted to read. Yes. In this letter, again, this letter is entirely in George Meade's handwriting. Now, when does the operational commander of an army write his own orders? Never. But here's a case where George Meade sat down and wrote a letter to John Reynolds. And I hate to say this is even an order. It starts out not orders such and such. It just starts out general. And then it mentions a dispatch that John Reynolds sent to Meade, which was also found in this envelope. And he begins talking about what's happening at Cashtown Gap and the enemy at Chambersburg and so forth. But then he says this, he has just issued orders that morning for the First Corps to go to Gettysburg. Reynolds didn't get that order in a timely manner, but ultimately he got it. And Meade says this in the letter. He says, in case of an advance in force against you at Gettysburg or Howard at Emmitsburg, now he's already ordered him to Gettysburg, you will fall back to that place, and I will reinforce you from the corps nearest to you, which are Sickles at Taneytown and Slocum at Littlestown. Then he says, please, get this, please. You ever seen an operational commander tell his subordinate, please? Instead of do it, it's please. Get all the information you can and post yourself up in the roads and routes of communication. Now, what's the roads and routes of communication? Well, it's the Chambersburg Pike. That's where Lee's army is stretched out on. That's where all the communications are going on. And then he says, P.S.
Mhm.
If after occupying your present position, it is your judgment that you would be in a better position at Emmitsburg than where you are, you can fall back to that place without waiting for the enemy or further orders from me. And he signs that letter, truly yours. I've never seen an order like it. But it shows you the closeness between the two of them more than anything I can try to verbalize. They're very close.
Okay.
And what strikes me about that rivalry, I mean, how many times have we seen in any field, rivalries can become toxic very quickly?
Oh yeah, oh yeah.
And it seems that even though it's very much a rivalry, there's still a level of respect between the two.
Yes.
Even at times, it's not, I mean, certainly I don't think there were nights where Meade was like, hey, great, Reynolds got one over on me. I'm so happy to see this from my good friend John.
Yeah.
But it doesn't get toxic. And I think when it comes push to shove, here he is using his quote unquote rival as his main means of instituting his campaign, which doesn't always happen.
And I would say this, that main instrument of instituting the campaign, now he's ordering all these other corps to move north too, at the same morning. So it's not just Reynolds, it's Sykes to Hanover, it's Sedgwick to Manchester, it's Slocum to Two Taverns. They're all moving in advance of Pipe Creek, considerably, 10 miles or more. But what is critical about John Reynolds is that his wing of the army is the one that where there seems to be the heaviest enemy activity. From all the reports Meade can get, that seems to be where the enemy is directed toward that wing. And he's correct in assuming that, because that's what happened. But that's the only thing that makes Reynolds special in this, is that he's now in charge of that wing, and it's the one that is most likely to run into trouble.
And so along those lines in the book, again, there's been a lot of commentary from readers and social media about your premise that Reynolds is ultimately advanced to Gettysburg as an advanced guard. So do you want to take the story from there and tell us, what you think Reynolds is really doing at Gettysburg? Yeah,
what he is, I mean, absolutely clearly, he is what Dennis Hart Mahan, his old instructor of military science at West Point, Meade's old instructor, Reynolds' old instructor. He was there for a long time. It's what he referred to as an advanced guard, using Clausewitz as well as Jomini. Both of them comment on the same thing. But here's Mahan's statement in his book, The Outpost. He says, when an enemy's position is to be reconnoitered with a view to force him to show his hand by causing him to call out all his troops, then a large detachment of all arms adequate to the task of pressing the enemy vigorously and also of withdrawing with safety when pressed in turn must be thrown forward. Now, to break that down, we've already heard Meade wants him to perform a reconnaissance. He wants all the information Reynolds can give him. But it's not a reconnaissance where you just go out there and take your binoculars and see what you can find. What the purpose of this mission is to cause the enemy, being on the roads and routes of communication of the enemy will do this, cause the enemy to collect in front of you. Once they collect in front of you, now Meade will have an opportunity to see something up as close as he can get that's occurring on his front, not dealing with almost imaginary people. He's now collecting them in front of him somewhere. And once the enemy collects in front of this advance guard, you call it, advance force, and undoubtedly opens fire, it is the object of the mission for that advance force to begin to fall back and continue to fall back. It's a fighting withdrawal, but you're falling back all the time. And as Clausewitz remarked, I mean, you can send an advance corps 20 miles ahead. You can send it 10 miles ahead. And the point is, how long do you think you can hold those forces back as you're retreating? And when Winfield Scott Hancock was interviewed before the Joint Committee on that very mission, he referred to it as a mask, which is the same thing. Meade, already determining he wants to defend Pipe Creek, will mask it by sending all his units forward 10 miles or so, with the purpose of drawing the enemy to him, and then they in turn drawing the enemy back to the position where the operational commander wants to defend. And in the 19th century, that's how they do it. I have a dear friend. There's another anecdote. I like anecdotes. General Richard Treffry, lieutenant. He's a lieutenant general, retired, former commander of NATO, and he commanded the first nuclear missile battery in the United States Army in Korea. But General Treffry is a great student of warfare, and he and I speak on the phone a lot. I did legal work back in my law days for an organization of which he was a member. And that's where we got to know one another. But I was on the phone with him, about a month ago. And we got talking. He was reading my book. And I asked him, I said, General, I said, look, tell me, you're a student of Dennis Mahan. He says, yes, sir, I am. And I said, tell me, is that still the doctrine of the United States Army, to send an advance corps forward to cause the enemy to collect information? He says, you bet it is. It is still the doctrine of the United States Army. I go, what? But General, they have aerial reconnaissance. We got satellites. We got all this stuff. They can see where everybody is. He says, that's not the point. The point is to get the enemy to collect in front of you. And so we still do that. We'll still send elements, and they got to be big. You can't send a small unit out. A couple of brigades of cavalry won't do. You've got to send a big unit of all arms, artillery, infantry, cavalry, everything, out forward. In today's army, it's the same thing. You send a big command, infantry, artillery, armor out forward to cause the enemy to not only notice you, but become alarmed at your presence, collect in front of you, and then you begin to fight a withdrawal. And the object being to draw the enemy to you, where you want to fight him. And otherwise, I mean, Meade's just blind otherwise, and this causes the enemy to collect.
Okay.
So that's its mission, that's its purpose.
If I could, you mentioned Hancock's testimony before the Joint Committee. I know you're an attorney by trade. This has got to excite you to see us reading testimony here and stuff like that.
I by the way, I once told someone that writing this book was like writing an appellate brief with George Meade as my client.
There you go. So Hancock testifies that General Reynolds, quote, General Reynolds beat them to Gettysburg. General Reynolds at once advanced to the relief of Buford and engaged the enemy, knowing that it was no time to inquire about future operations, and that the only thing was to attack the enemy and delay him until the commander of the army could come to some decision. Whether General Reynolds had received the order designating Pipe Creek as the line of battle, which General Meade told me was in preparation, I do not know, end quote. So where I'm going with that is morning of July 1st here then is Reynolds does proceed to Gettysburg.
Right.
How much do you think Reynolds knows about Pipe Creek? And, in your opinion, how much at that point has Meade decided or not decided upon Pipe Creek?
Reynolds never gets the Pipe Creek circular.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we know that. At least, First Corps got it somewhere, but Reynolds was dead. But what Reynolds does know is that his mission is to withdraw to Emmitsburg.
Right. Okay.
Now, interestingly, when the Pipe Creek circular is issued, like around 1:30, what does Meade do there? He tells every one of those commanders, Slocum, Sykes, Sedgwick, all of them, to engage the enemy. If it collects in front of you, engage, but then withdraw. And he gives them specific instructions where to withdraw. With Reynolds, his initial instruction was to withdraw to Emmitsburg. But once Meade issues the Pipe Creek circular, he has Reynolds now protecting the left flank at Middleburg, which is 7-8 miles east of Emmitsburg.
Yeah.
And so an alarm is raised with Meade. And he says, well, I've got to make sure Reynolds withdraws to Middleburg and not Emmitsburg. Now he still thinks Reynolds is living. And Reynolds by this time is dead. But Meade, nevertheless, what he does, he sends Hancock's Second Corps forward for one purpose and one purpose only on July 1. And that is to move up the Taneytown Road, let it be known to Reynolds, who again, he still thinks is living, to withdraw with the Second Corps back down the Taneytown Road to Middleburg and not to Emmitsburg. And that's the whole reason he sends the Second Corps forward, is to make sure he falls back on a large force that can help direct the First Corps back toward Taneytown. And as you know, being a Carroll County resident, the Krause Road off the old Frederick Road takes you right to Middleburg.
Krause Mill Road, right off.
That's it.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a state of alarm. You can sense it in the messages that Meade kind of goes, damn, we've got to make sure Reynolds falls back here and not there, given what I've just done with all the rest of the army. And he sends Second Corps out there to make sure the mistake is rectified.
Okay.
But notice he's got every one of those corps doing the same thing. Fascinating to me. I had one fellow, by the way, some years ago, was given a talk about this sort of thing. And he came up to me and he told me that it was the first time I ever heard a fellow in the Army talk about this sort of tactic or stratagem, really. And he was the former head of military police in Germany in the Cold War. And he told me, we did that all the time. And he said, I know, because I was the traffic cop out there. And he said, these units would go forward for the sole purpose of causing the other side to react. And he said, invariably, the purpose was to draw that fictitious enemy back to where you want to fight it.
Mm-hmm.
And so, it is interesting. This is still the doctrine in the Army.
Yeah. And obviously in Reynolds' case, as we all know, he gets killed too early. So obviously whatever Reynolds was thinking really doesn't have time to develop and form from there.
And the tough part, and I'm a huge Reynolds fan, have been since I bought the Nichols book back in the 1960s. I guess it's still the only book written on John Reynolds.
Maybe you should do why don't you do another one after this?
Oh, that's a good book. I don't think I could add much more to that. But I've almost lost my train of thought, what I wanted to say.
Yeah, I was talking about Reynolds getting killed early and how it really doesn't give time to.
The hard part for me in writing that chapter with Reynolds was one, I deeply admire him, and I for me to find, and I use the word fault here, and I don't mean to find fault anywhere. Reynolds moves out of Marsh Creek that morning with 1 division, and he leaves 2 to move up. They're an hour behind him. And you remember Mahan says, you've got to use a large force to do this.
Right.
And Mahan goes on, and so does Clausewitz. It's 1/5 or 1/7 of the army it takes to do this. With George Meade, he's got it all across the front, every one of his corps are out there. But with Reynolds, he had to bring a sizable force up there, which at a minimum was the entire First Corps. And notice when Howard responds to Reynolds' movement, and Meade has ordered Howard to take the 11th Corps and support Reynolds. What does Howard do? He says, I'll stop at the Wentz's place. Well, that's the peach orchard. We all know, you guys know that. How many times a day do you go to the peach orchard, you guys? I mean, 3, 4, 5, 6, I don't know. But
as many as possible, Kent.
But Howard's looking at his residential map, and he says, we'll stop at the Wentz's place. Well, what he's there to do is, and I think Howard is precisely on target here, and that is Reynolds is farther up ahead. If Reynolds starts drawing the enemy to him and they get into a fight and he starts to withdraw, he withdraws back to the 11th Corps. So he's going to support him in that sense. He's going to be the corps on which Reynolds will fall back to. But the problem with Reynolds, he's got 1 division. It's not enough. And the battle gets quickly out of hand. Of course, he is quickly killed too. And when he's killed, and here's where you got to really feel for Abner Doubleday in this.
Yeah.
I mean, I really honestly do. Do I think Meade was correct in doing what he did with Doubleday? Yes. But do I feel for Doubleday? Yes, I do. I try not to let the reader know all my feelings, but you do. Reynolds had told Doubleday, so Doubleday wrote that his mission was to draw the enemy toward him, engage, but then withdraw to Emmitsburg. And when he is notified that Reynolds is dead, I got this letter from this collector in Southern California, who 9-page letter written by the Judge Advocate General in Doubleday's division. And he's standing there with Doubleday when Doubleday's notified of the death of his commander. And what does Doubleday say? He says, I have no idea what Reynolds intended doing here. Meaning we were supposed to all fall back in this. Why is he tactically engaged here? And he says, the only thing I know how to do is fight it out. I guess that's what he wanted to do.
Yeah, and that's interesting that you brought up Doubleday, because you're right. There's that passage in his report that people seldom refer to, or may not even be aware of, where he says he's talked to Reynolds. Reynolds is going to dispute the enemy's advance, but fall back in the event of a serious attack to Emmitsburg, and that would support, I think, your premise.
There it is. There it is. There it is.
It's interesting. Often in the Gettysburg campaign, the standard kind of interpretation of Meade is that he's being very risk adverse, to use, I think, a more modern term, that he's not being very aggressive. To me, this is very much a calculated risk in what he's
it is.
Not knowing the the disposition of the Army of Northern Virginia, look at how day one goes historically.
Yeah, yeah.
It
No,
could have
you're
been a
right.
much greater disaster for the Army of the Potomac had things gone, but I think it shows, I think, as you kind of point out, the need to know this information.
Right.
Meade willing to take that risk to do that. And I think it kind of paints a little different picture of Meade than kind of the passive, risk-adverse general that sometimes he's made out to be.
Absolutely. No, that's a great point. That's a great point.
And, that's a good segue. I mean, at the end of the day, and I often say this, we tend to treat it like fantasy football. There are still a lot of things that happen outside of the sight lines of the commanding generals. Reynolds is killed. The First Corps gets engaged. The 11th Corps gets engaged. Ultimately, the Third Corps is ordered up, and it just, as you said, kind of continues to escalate from there.
Right.
Kent, in your mind, then, at what point does Meade's plan change from falling back to we're going to fight at Gettysburg? You want to kind of take the listeners through that evolution?
Well, he, of course, is apprised of what's happened up there in Gettysburg with Reynolds, and the fact that General Howard has, in the midst of all that, was called forward from his position at the Wentz's place. And as a result of the day's actions, the two corps, 1st and 11th, have been badly handled and retreat through the town. Some people cite a disorderly retreat of many. Some, say that there was efforts to defend those retreating forces, but whatever, they go back to Cemetery Hill and the western slope of Culp's Hill. And that's where they are at night, where Otto von Steinwehr's division was placed by Howard early in his movement toward Gettysburg that day. And hearing these messages coming in of the two corps being shattered, and they really were shattered. And you get those great reminiscences and writings of men in the 2nd Corps as they're moving up, hopefully to have Reynolds fall back on them. And here they see this wreckage coming at them from Gettysburg. Wagons everywhere. They had to pull revolvers out, put them in the heads of these wagon drivers to get them off the road. It's the detritus of a defeated commands coming down the Taneytown Road. And Meade, getting these reports coming in of how bad it was up there, that they have fallen back, he begins to issue orders for the rest of the army to move toward Gettysburg. He resolves to abandon the Pipe Creek line and his whole defensive ideals for the campaign, and move to the defense of those two corps that had been mangled. And so one corps after another is directed toward Gettysburg. And what's interesting is that when he starts issuing orders, for instance, to the 6th Corps and to the 5th Corps to move forward, look what's already happened. And he hasn't issued one order yet. The 1st Corps is already at Gettysburg, mangled, as is the 11th Corps. Howard called forward your friend Dan Sickles.
Our friend.
Everyone.
He's everyone's friend.
And so they're approaching Gettysburg already. So you got 3 of the 7 Corps there. Meade has already ordered the 2nd Corps forward, not because of the crisis at Gettysburg, but in order to have Reynolds fall back upon it. So it's on its way. So now you've got 4 of the 7 Corps already en route or there. And you've got the 12th Corps at two taverns. It's not far. It's near Gettysburg by evening. So there's 5 of the 7 corps. And now you've got the 5th and the 6th Corps. And those guys are, particularly the 6th Corps, are in for a grueling march from Manchester all the way 32 miles. I don't know if there was a shoe left in the 6th Corps. I mean,
Right.
or the 5th even, I mean, from Hanover. So yeah, he's ordered everything there.
I was going to go by this topic, but since you brought up Sickles in the 3rd Corps, we did have a
I knew we'd get into this guy.
We did have a listener question from superfan Scott from the New England area, kind of on this topic. But you've talked about all the corps being ordered forward on July 1st, and obviously over the years, Slocum has gotten some criticism for whether or not he should have come fast enough. But Sickles coming out of Emmitsburg has always been portrayed as marching to the sound of the guns, which, would be a very favorable Sickles portrayal. I've always argued, though, and this is again where I think I'm more neutral on Sickles than people give me credit for. I've always argued, in fact, that if you look at the whole chain of events, Sickles hesitates to come out of Emmitsburg. And one of the reasons why he hesitates to come out of Emmitsburg is because he's been told how important it is to stay there. So the question we got from superfan Scott would be, Kent, what do you make of all that? Should these guys have come forward immediately to Gettysburg? Should these guys be more aware of the fallback position? Just what do you think of all that?
You mean being asked to come forward by Howard as opposed
to... Yeah.
Well, I'll tell you what, I think to Sickles' credit, he came forward, but he did very deliberately.
Mm-hmm.
You notice. Doesn't take a whole lot of time. I mean, to get from Emmitsburg to the Marsh Creek, or
and then Cemetery Hill. Yeah.
But, well, no, to the Wentz's place.
Yeah.
Go up the Emmitsburg Pike. Yet he does so very, very deliberately. And he justified, because Reynolds was concerned about that flank. Reynolds was concerned about enemy activity from Fairfield toward the left of the army. And Sickles was mindful of that. And Sickles, I think, moved deliberately for that very reason. I mean, heavens, you get to Marsh Creek, and there's the road right to Fairfield. What if they pop through there?
Yeah.
I mean, where am I to go? So you kind of feel for him in that situation too. But I think he overcame it by just moving at a pace where he felt, well, I can still respond in case there is an emergency.
Right. And
there's no evidence that I have found, written or otherwise, that tells me that, other than what I judge to be the pace of that corps as it moved.
Yeah, which is a good point.
Be deliberate.
Good point. And of course, ultimately, he leaves a few brigades and some batteries back at Emmitsburg to kind of hedge his bets on this. Such that when Meade finds out Sickles is leaving Emmitsburg, Meade has Butterfield fire off a note that basically says, "Don't leave Emmitsburg. The commanding general wants you to keep somebody here."
Yeah, I comment in the book, by the way, on that story about just telling the reader to know how difficult it is to communicate.
Yeah.
In 1863, with an army that is as spread out as this army, and trying to keep up with where everybody is at every moment is impossible. And trying to get people to do things who are far flung from you, where all you've got is a rider to get there, and you don't know what's happened in between times, is extraordinarily difficult. And there's a great example of just how difficult the communications were. Yeah.
And that was another thing I think you do well in the book. You talk about how telegraph lines are cut and things of that nature, and how much of a delay it can be for Meade and Halleck to communicate with each other, which again, I don't know how often people think of that.
No, none. And the Baltimore Pike, of course, which now becomes critical. Now that, the Army has given up the field west of Gettysburg and is concentrating along Cemetery and Culp's Hill, and then ultimately down Cemetery Ridge to the Round Tops. What the Baltimore Pike, a lot of people say, well, he got the high ground. Yeah, we've all heard this stuff. High ground's great. High ground can really give you an advantage. However, high ground alone is not enough. If you have high ground and then you've got something like Cemetery Ridge running off to the south from Cemetery Hill, well, as Hancock, as Howard, as Meade, everyone said, our left can be turned here. So, okay, we got some high ground, but our left can be turned. Okay, that's one problem with it. The next problem is the Baltimore Pike. That pike runs right along the crest of Cemetery Hill and right behind Culp's Hill. And you will ultimately have an entire Confederate corps threatening that pike. So, and this, as I said, these are the bitter fruits of what happened on July 1 to me. That's the words I use. Is that you've now got the Army situated where it is. The Baltimore Pike is the only means by which that Army can get to Westminster, which is Meade's supply base that he set up, by the way. In spite of all that's going on July 1, Meade ultimately set up the supply base of the Army at Westminster on that morning. And so all the trains, all the wagon trains of all the corps have been moved there. And it's 22 miles southeast of Gettysburg. And from the moment Meade gets there at Gettysburg and sets up his defense lines, that pike is shut down. The only thing that gets through there on occasion are messengers who are like the Pony Express. These are Adams Express Company people, some of them are Army people. But every 7 miles is a fresh rider and a horse. And they keep moving messages from one rider to the next, all the way down the 22 miles to Westminster. And then they have riders going every 7 miles from Westminster to Baltimore. So you could send a message out of Gettysburg and possibly in 6 hours, you could telegraph it from Baltimore to Washington. But that's it. But for the most part, that is shut down. And what's really critical for the poor Army is they can't get any of those supplies up. And the Army becomes crippled. It really becomes crippled.
Yeah, and that was something you drew out in the chapters on the retreat that, again, I think we often don't talk about. But at this point here, we've been going for a little bit over an hour. We've obviously focused on the build-up to Gettysburg in July 1st. Are you guys comfortable if we move to July 2nd at this point? Because I want to make sure we don't run out of time before we do some Meade Sickles stuff and other things like that. Or do you get anything on July 1st?
Yeah, I think that'd be great since we just agreed that Sickles made a good decision earlier.
Yeah, we should build on that, right?
Right.
We could build on that.
The one time people agree that he did something right.
You know what? There's still going to be people that aren't going to give him credit for it.
Well, hold up, my dear. We're getting into July 2nd, so
yeah, let's
shattered.
Pick up that story. This might be a good point to end part 1 of our special Kent Masterson Brown Meade at Gettysburg episode, and pick up part 2 at July 2nd and beyond. Would you guys agree with that?
That works for me.